From airport security protocols to trust in public institutions, many facets of American life changed in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. In New York City, one of the major changes appeared in policing, specifically in the use of so-called stop-and-frisk policies. Officers temporarily detaining, questioning, and at times searching civilians on suspicion of potential criminal behavior. And I want to bring in tonight's panel on this former CIA officer and FBI Special Agent Tracy Walder and former NYPD Deputy Commissioner Wilbur Chapman to examine how stop and frisk has evolved. Thank you so much for being here. And let's start with you, Wilbur. Stop and frisk was in place in some areas before 9/11 and in New York, but certainly that number of stops climbing higher each year for nearly a decade afterwards. Wilbur, was this a positive move for the city? And where does stop and frisk stand now in New York?
Good evening, Natasha. I think it's important on a solemn day like this that we acknowledge the work of our first responders and the ultimate sacrifice they made on 9/11 and the sacrifices they make every day by putting themselves in harm's way to keep us safe. After 9/11, there was a complete shift in policing. Number one, prior to that, we were very much interested in reducing crime. Terrorism took a back seat. After the attacks, it was imperative that particularly New York City develop an apparatus that would not only prevent an attack, but make sure that anyone who might plan one would be apprehended before they could execute it. So at that time, Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly put together probably the most comprehensive apparatus in the country. It was so effective that New York did not suffer another attack. And the three commissioners that followed Commissioner Kelly did not have to make any substantial changes in it to keep New Yorkers safe. So I think that's one issue. Where New York made a mistake was in the implementation of stop and frisk as a wide range policy affecting basically people of color, thinking that that was going to reduce crime. And it really didn't. What it wound up doing was causing a court case that New York City lost and hampering the efforts of police officers using it as the tool that they can, because it's very important in reducing crime to have that tool available and to utilize it when appropriate.
Wilbur, I hear you. Thank you for making that distinction and also for honoring our first responders. I appreciate that. I do want to move over to you, Tracy. We do know there was this 2013 class action lawsuit, right, that successfully argued that stop and frisk had been used in an unconstitutional manner in the city and that officers needed to provide clearer justification for stopping someone on the street. Tracy, can you talk a little bit about the impact that that lawsuit had?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Natasha. It's good to see you again. And like Commissioner Chapman, I do want to honor those who lost their lives on September 11th. It's a hard day for me, being in the Counterterrorism Center on September 11th. I feel very responsible for what happened. I think with stop and frisk, as the commissioner was pointing out, it became more and more, I guess we can say, racially motivated. And what was happening is the stop and frisk was operating outside of the parameters in which it was intended to. And what you started to see were laws that were sort of tightening those parameters, specifically in 2015, the Rodriguez case versus the United States, really where what happened with that is you had a police officer who was writing a traffic ticket and used that time to extend the traffic ticket and the traffic stop to search the person's vehicle with a dog. And that's not protected under stop and frisk. So what we're seeing now is really this sort of codifying stop and frisk and really setting very strict limitations in terms of what law enforcement officers can and what law enforcement officers can't do. And it's interesting, I teach criminal justice, and one of the things I always tell my students is the making of laws is really always about sort of tolerance. What are the American people willing to tolerate? And when you look at something like September 11th, pre-September 11th, people wouldn't have tolerated TSA. People wouldn't have tolerated the extensive security checks that we have. However, as a result, now it's expected. And it's really the same thing with stop and frisk. It was sort of a wider net that was cast immediately after September 11th. And as we've moved away from it, it's become smaller and smaller in terms of the net that one can cast with stop and frisk.
All right, Wilbur and Tracy, I certainly appreciate both of your perspectives, especially on this day and your time. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find News Nation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.